Our next session is a panel debate looking at how to achieve meaningful change in the lives of workers and communities by enabling better business learning and decision making. What's good data? How do we move from output to outcomes, as this conference is asking? And how do we use supply chain information to drive change and show progress? Our moderator is Mark Hodge, a senior associate with Shift, a non-profit organisation that equips businesses with the knowledge, skills and incentives to respect human rights. Mark co-leads Shift's Valuing Respect project that focuses on developing better ways to evaluate business respect for human rights. He has extensive insight into how businesses implement the UN guiding principles. Mark, welcome. Where is he? There he is. I've lost you. I couldn't find you.
Thanks very much. I think this is working. I'm going to sit, and I'm going to invite the panelists to come up now as well that are going to join me. Thank you for that kind introduction. My role this afternoon is to moderate this discussion, and I believe I have an iPad here so that I can gather your questions. So, good afternoon. Again, thank you for the very kind introduction. I, as was just mentioned, work for an organization called Shift, and I lead a project that is really focused on how do we move from outputs to outcomes. I am spending every day at the moment thinking about how do we change behavior? How do we build new knowledge, new information that drives behavior change, that delivers meaningful outcomes? And we've heard a lot about that this morning. I was reflecting just now before the panel. Even with Leslie this morning, right? With those 4 examples she shares, how's it just providing new information about transparency in the supply chain, where factories are, how many workers are there? What does that actually enable in terms of identifying issues and driving meaningful change? And what does data also drive in terms of new action? How does it empower the disempowered to act? And I was reflecting on, I think what came up a lot this morning was this desire in this room to make sure the information, the data that we gather sits in a virtuous circle with behavior. And also that behavior allows us to get more transparency in data. And that's something that I know all of the panelists have been working on, in some instances for many decades, trying to get this right. And so I'm really pleased to be joined by them. There will be a poll, so have your phones at the ready. Start hunting in your pockets now for them. And I warn you, it's quite a difficult poll because it's quite a long question and long answers, and you only have a certain amount of time to answer. So be at the ready while I just say a few words about how we'll proceed. As I said, I'm being joined by 4 thoughtful individuals who all work in various ways in the space of responsible ethical supply chain, and have been doing it for multiple decades, as I said, between them. I've been struck by something over the last week or so that I've been talking to Antoine and also Gillian and Rona and also Aisha, that you are each as individuals really trying to work with very practical tools. You're trying to say, hey, let's provide really practical ways forward that businesses, suppliers, buyers, factories can actually use to get more meaningful data. And we're going to hear today, part of the substance will be the SAQ in Sedex. How do we improve that and make that better? How do we improve social audit data? How do we work with worker voice in a more meaningful way? But I've also noticed that each of them are leaning into many of the challenges that were raised this morning. How do we fix the limits of data and how of social compliance audit, and how do we evolve it? How do we move from pass-fail to continuous improvement? How do we manage the reality that it's humans collecting information and we're flawed and we don't necessarily always have the right skill set to identify the problems and issues and even engage workers in a way that is open and empowering for issues to come up? And how do we really lean into, though it's quite new, this worker voice technology, how to lean into what's possible with it, but also some of its limits as well. And I've been really pleased that my role as moderator doesn't need to be to sit here and say, yeah, but what about this problem, right? What about this problem with your solution? Because all of you are grappling with that real time and finding solutions, so that's nice. So we'll have some time in this panel to talk about that, and then we'll step back because you've also got 4 strategic thinkers that are really trying to think about this question around data and how we drive change through data, and how can we drive meaningful change, right? Meaningful change for workers and communities as well. So it's poll time. So I hope all of you have your phones at the ready. If there's a way is there a way we can show the question and then not put people on the timer? Can we do that? It should be. I don't have a clicker.
Is there a clicker up there?
So I should show the question. Thank you. That helps. Oh, okay. So we've had a lot this morning, and here's a chance to give another perspective from all of you. It's one of those horrible questions where you have to select one answer. And so when you think about the role of data in scaling responsible business practice, what do you think is the biggest challenge we face in this list? Is it just a lack of reliable data about the problems we face? Limited incentives for suppliers to share data about challenges, about problems. Limited opportunities for workers to share about their realities on their own terms. Not enough urgency to invest in systemic issues, lack of data about how effective our solutions are, right? Or lack of evidence about the business case for responsible conduct. Vote now. I feel like I should do the little countdown clock noise. But
I mean, the Jeopardy song.
or the Jeopardy song for anyone from that side of the pond.
No, true. Sorry.
Interesting. Good. So I love that it's moving. Thank you, the 208 people that voted. That's great. Okay, so we're gonna pull on that. I'm not going to try and reflect on that too much. Interesting that the bottom two around lack of evidence, right, around the drivers of not working. People are pretty convinced, it seems, that we've got ways forward and solutions to make. Okay, so that's for you all as well to think about as we move forward here. So first round of contributions from each of you, I'm going to invite you all just to profile your work. I think that part of the reason people come to Sedex is just to learn what people are doing in practical terms and what they can do to take away with that. So I'd like to just give you the freedom to do that. And also I know as you do that, you'll be digging into some of these kind of more kind of systemic or kind of existential questions about your own work as well. So Rona, I'd like to start with you. You created and led McDonald's for many years, McDonald's social compliance program, and really from the ground up. And so you have a huge amount of experience in that regards. And within that, you started identifying that one of the training the trainers of kind of auditors was really important to build that capacity in the system. And now you find yourself at APSCA entirely focused on this role. So could you just talk to us and for everyone in the room, why is auditor professionalism and important, right? Why is it important for gathering good data? Why is it important for buyers and suppliers? What's the role of APSCA in doing this? And also, can you just provide a few examples of what you're finding about the challenges of the capacity among auditors and how you think we should address them?
Sure. I'll start by defining APSCA. As Martine said, for those of you that were here last year, she said it's probably one of the only acronyms she condones. So it's the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors, hence APSCA. It's much easier. It's still a mouthful, but hopefully it's an acronym that you can embrace. APSCA actually started back in 2015 with 9 founding audit firm members. They range from the very large audit firm members, a couple of small and a couple of medium-sized firms. So, you know, the 9 founding audit firm members really tried to focus on the fact that it was the 6th attempt by the industry to professionalize. They wanted to make sure they had all the right people at the table to sit down and have that robust, strong conversation about why was it the 6th attempt by the industry to professionalize? You know, what had we not been able to do well right before? Was it simply, you know, the time was right, making sure that we had all the right people at the table? And I think having those 9 founding audit firm members, forming that multi-stakeholder board, which I was actually part of in my previous role at McDonald's, and making sure that we really sat down and spoke to the people that were the buyers of the audits, the users of the audits, the recipients of the audits, to sort of find out what did they need, what did they see as being a gap in the industry itself. We spent a lot of time, like I said, forming that stakeholder board, but then also forming working groups. We formed 3 different working groups, and I'll just talk about 2 working groups because the output of those 2 particular working groups formed the competency framework. The competency framework identifies the areas that we feel should be part of a social compliance audit, and that social compliance auditors should be capable and skilled to be able to go and execute. Now, as part of that, particularly working group 1, who are really focused on identifying those categories, we focused on, should we just gather every social compliance audit that's out there, have a look at what everybody's asking, and then be a combination of all of that? You know, should we make sure that auditors were capable of auditing to everything? And as we started working our way through, we were like, actually, a lot of social compliance audits have become a bit of a dumping ground for anything that somebody wants to ask a question of. Let's just throw it into a social compliance audit. Why not? You know, the auditors all wear their Superman, Superwoman cape every day as they sort of fly into the factory and try and cover, 27,000 different categories in that 1 or 2 day audit. So we also set about within that working group 1 to say, well, let's really take a good hard look at what a social compliance auditor should be expected to achieve during the time of the audit. What should their competency be? And I don't even know why I'm looking down because I'm so far off script now, I don't even know what. But as we started thinking about some of the things that are included in the social compliance audit is structural integrity, electrical wiring, et cetera, within a factory. Those are professions in their own right. And so we really started to focus on APSCA's mission of enhancing the professionalism of the social compliance industry. So it was defining what is that professionalism? What does that mean? What should that auditor be able to achieve and accomplish and be skilled in which to execute against? And it doesn't include structural integrity. It does not include being an electrician and telling you whether your wiring's correct. So part of our role as APSCA is to be very clear and articulate what we are and what we are not. So as we've gone about doing that, and we developed and launched our competency framework back in 2017, and all of this is publicly available information. It's on our website. You can go on and you can see exactly what we're testing the auditors to. Now, we're not saying that every single audit has to only contain those particular categories, but what we are being really clear about is, using those APSCA enrolled auditors, using those auditors that have gone through the examination process. If your audit is going to go beyond that, how are you making sure that the auditors have those skills and competencies to go beyond? So as we worked with our 9 and now 40 odd audit firms and enrolling their over 3,200 auditors into the APSCA system, we are going about reviewing those audit logs because we want to provide a mechanism for you that as you're receiving an audit, whether it's part of mutual recognition, as you are deciding which audit firms that you want to work with, you can work with the individual firms to say, hey, we want to make sure that the auditors put their individual APSCA number on that report. We want to make sure that we understand that they are going through that process, understanding that we're still, even though we're into year 3 now, we're heading into year 3, that we are actually still in that learning phase, and so we are still growing and we're still developing, but being with us on that journey and saying to your audit firms, we want individually enrolled auditors, we want those numbers on that audit report. I have a whole lot more to say, but you know what, I'm sure that my 5 minutes are more than well and truly up, but that's APSCA.
Thank you, Rona.
So one other thing I'll tell, because you did ask the question about what categories are we starting to see the gaps on.
We just talk about just 2 or 3 insights around what you're finding in terms of competencies. What are the key challenges? Yeah,
so some of the key challenges right now, and so as we've got about 700-800 people who have actually gone through the exam right now, part 1 of the exam, and there's the average of areas where people are probably struggling a little bit more is freedom of association, data collection and analysis. Those are some of the sort of the top 2 categories that people are sort of really struggling on average with. Obviously, there's some people that are very good at that, but those are the biggest categories right now.
Thank you. Gillian, you've been involved, from what I can tell over the last week, with this issue of responsible supply chains and ethical compliance from a whole range of angles, from working inside Bacavar and leading the ethical compliance program, advising a range of companies with nGaje now, providing practical tools for companies, and also working closely with Sedex. So I'd love to invite you to talk about two things in particular. One is you've been very involved with Sedex around the SAQ, and would love to hear about your insights around the limits and where we should be going with the SAQ, where we could improve that, and also with your worker polling tools with nGaje, and explain more about, I suppose, the different types of information that provides.
Okay, well, thank you, and it's great to be here. Some of you in the audience might wonder why I'm here as nGaje, because I know quite a lot of people in the room, and I've normally been known as either Bacavar ALP or my original company, which was HR Angel. It just happened to be this week we're rebranding. So it was a good opportunity to say I'm Gillian from nGaje. For many of you who know me, I'm an independent HR consultant, and I've worked in the food industry for over 30 years, so I've seen, and in fact, actually, I was working in food when Sedex started for a company called Geest, who were a founder member of Sedex. So I've actually been around an awful long time, which sometimes is depressing, actually, to be honest. But having seen that, I have seen the development of all the different parts of Sedex, and particularly the SAQ. And I can remember the journey that I've been on with loads of organisations where we fill in the SAQ and we just leave it, and actually, unless somebody asked us a question, we didn't really do very much with it. And it might be that the auditor said, well, you should have really updated it, because the policy is that every 6 months it should be updated. It's only recently, I think, we started to realise that actually it doesn't add particularly great value, and therefore maybe it should change and it should be different. And the way I tend to work with my clients is that I tend to get to know their businesses quite well. So I end up having to advise them on how to complete the SAQ, which obviously can be interesting. But also it's about how they actually manage to do a good job of their ethical audits. Now, if you're an A, B or a B member, most of them will be required to fill in the SAQ every 6 months and are supposed to update it. It can be a bit of a chore, and it's never something that people come to me and say, well, actually, I got a lot out of filling that in, and it really drove some changes in my business. I've been part of the, it's the Sedex Stakeholder Forum now. I can't remember what the old name was. And it's one of the things that I used to bring up, that actually it should be something that actually does add value and should be a practical tool. You mentioned tools at the beginning. For me, I think if you provide practical tools to businesses that they can actually see add value, it will make a difference, and people will want to use it. They won't say, well, I have to do it. And I was at a meeting yesterday, and one of the comments that really came back was that quite often people are members of Sedex, they fill in SAQs because somebody else has told them they have to do it, not because they as an organisation particularly want to do it for themselves. So therefore, you're always almost a little bit on the back foot when you started. So to use this as a tool that actually they will get a benefit, I think will be really good. The other thing that I suppose over time I started to realise with the SAQ is that it does drive the risk assessment process. So the way you answer the questions will determine often whether you are a low, medium or high risk business. And that will then determine how frequently you have to have an ethical audit, or if you have to have one at all. And therefore it mattered actually to the companies that are filling it in that it was accurate, but actually it also was starting to drive the wrong behaviours, because actually it was better for them to fill in what they thought other people wanted to hear rather than the reality on the ground, because then maybe they wouldn't have to have an ethical audit. So it was driving quite a lot of the wrong behaviours, and organisations, whether they were retailers or different organisations, were using this information and actually started to make decisions on it. But actually, it's not really accurate. And we know that because part of the project, the SAQ working group, was to review the data and determine whether it was accurate or not. And we know, compared to the information when auditors go on the ground and actually check things out, there isn't a strong correlation between what actually is put in the SAQ and what the auditor finds on the ground. So it actually wasn't accurate. So the project was to really reevaluate it and come up with something different. And that's quite a challenge. Sedex is a membership organisation. There are members, there are A members, there are AB members, there are B members. I'm told 50% of the membership is actually B members. So they're the ones that are actually probably filling in the SAQ more than anybody else. So we're trying to develop the new SAQ to be something that is much easier to use, less information. It does need to be information that can be verifiable, and I think that is a challenge on a technical platform when actually often we rely on the auditor to go and verify the information. So how can we use technology? So if, for example, you've ticked, I've got this policy, and then you've uploaded the policy, who checks that that policy is actually correct? Without it being necessarily a person that's actually got to go through all that information, because you can imagine with Sedex it's a vast volume of information, and technology can help us do that. So we're looking at that type of thing as well. But for me, it's about having a system whereby if you look down the supply chain, right the way down to the bottom, you've got smaller and smaller suppliers who can use the SAQ to understand what good looks like. They can self-assess themselves. They can then start to put in place action plans that say, I'm going to address this. But up the supply chain, they can see that that's going on, and there's less of a need to rely always on an audit. And maybe audits are about going where it really is high risk and where there really are issues, and you need to go on the ground. But you've got that greater visibility down the supply chain. We've just finished the first pilot, had a lot of very interesting feedback, so I think we'll be spending some time on that, but that's basically where we've got to on the SAQ bit.
Thank you, and maybe just briefly then in a few minutes, nGaje. Tell us about what the newly branded piece does.
Branded, yes. So in terms of nGaje, I run, alongside my consultancy business, I have an online tools business. It started off as an objective tracker whereby we were measuring performance management, and we've developed then surveys and polls, really because clients are saying we really want to hear worker voice, and we've heard so many times that worker voice and actually hearing really what people are saying is really important. The system works on the basis that you clients can run as many surveys and polls as you want, because I think we've got to start getting away from this big annual or every 2-year big survey, 65 questions, and use these tools to engage on a regular basis so it builds trust. You know, how can you be working as a worker and every 2 years suddenly they ask you a whole load of questions and maybe you don't actually see the output? So this is designed as a system whereby you can actually get really engaged with people. The difference between a survey and a poll, surveys tend to be asking questions where you'll probably answer whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree. Polls are trying to get at people's opinions and their feelings about how they want, whether they like working there. I often refer to it as to the Luton airport syndrome. Any of you that's been through an airport, you will have been through security, and they'll ask you, you know, how was your experience? And you get the little smiley faces, and depending on how you feel, you might go for the red one, or hopefully you might go for the amber or the green one. And it's that sort of principle. So we can do that in people's canteens, wherever they want it. And it tends to be things like, you know, do you like working here? Do you not like working here? Do you have a sort of, do you feel happy? And those we found actually, people can say they like working somewhere, but actually they can still be unhappy. So it's quite interesting, really. You did ask me the sorts of things that we would use it for, and particularly around actually getting staff involved in decisions. Quite often we'll have situations where it can be from the colour of the canteen to what sort of Christmas party type activity do you want to have, but actually getting much more people in an organisation to be able to give their opinion by using it on a smartphone or a tablet or on a kiosk in a canteen, and they just get to actually put their vote in. We use it for worker forums, so elections. We use it at the end of focus groups, where you've maybe done a short focus group. You can do a poll at the end to see, well, let's find out what the output is. Even from communication briefings, you know, how people actually understood the briefing that's going on. So it's really, really flexible. But the key thing for me is that you collect that information, but you have to do something with it. You have to have some actions. It doesn't always have to be a formal action plan, but people who've given you that information, they want to see you've done something with it and it's actually changed something for the better. Otherwise, when you ask them again, why should they bother to give you any more information? Because you didn't deal with the information at the beginning.
Thank you. And then continuing, so I like the thought there of building trust over time, making sure that with the SAQ there's a value add to the person inputting the data, it's not just for someone else, and also kind of getting to feelings versus just whether certain individual standards are in place. Antoine, founder and CEO of Ulula, kind of pioneering really this new, relatively new approach to kind of creating transparency and responsibility in supply chains. Can you talk a bit about worker voice and your view about what is Ulula's role in driving meaningful change for workers and communities? And also what ensures, even in that context, that data is good data? What's good worker voice data, right? Versus just any worker voice data?
All right, well, thanks Mark, and thanks to Sedex for the invitation. So Ulula is a worker engagement technology platform, and we specifically work to address what 26% of you see as the limitations for workers to give feedback on their own terms. So the way we do that is we're using simple mobile phones, things of your Nokia from the 2000s. We are really thinking about low tech and population that are offline, and enable them to have direct, anonymous, and two-way engagement in their own terms, in their preferred language, in their preferred channels, so that we can really make them at ease to give honest data. So what that means in concrete is, for instance, 3 examples. One is we've been working with Mars on high-risk suppliers, where I think the interesting part is we've been triangulating data. We've not come and try to be a substitute to other forms of data collection. So we've been working with, in this case, quite a bit with our friends at Impact to integrate audit data and worker-generated data to identify what are the priorities, what are the issues, and follow up on that. So after a few months, look at what are the issues that have been flagged, and from the perspective of workers, whether the interventions that have taken place are giving the results, are being effective. You may have done something, but it may not have the intended results, as we know. That can be the case. That's interesting because I think it's in integration with existing business practices, and that's good. In another context completely, we've been working with in the palm oil sector with growers and with the round table on sustainable palm oil in Malaysia and Indonesia, where it's a different use of worker voice, so to speak. So we've deployed our system in Sumatra, so really more last mile type of deployments, where we've enabled farmers on estates to send feedback about the working conditions. And in that case, there were already quite a few worries about what was going on in that space. And what was interesting is we got a lot of women feedback that was quite encouraging, because we are really trying to get to these more vulnerable segments of the population. And there were consequences, I think, for that grower, and quite a few management changes that took place, and a few other actions that took place at the RSPO level. And now we're expanding that in Malaysia, in Sabah, with some of the major growers in the space, to do both grievance mechanisms and surveys. So to try to also to have more structured engagement, where we don't rely on one-on-one engagements, but really more reliable forms. And the third example is trying to show how you can scale that up. So an example of that is, again, identifying how we can go really to I think, very vulnerable populations. So we're working in the DRC with hundreds of mines in the mineral supply chain. And it's a project that we're doing with Apple, where they're interested in having human rights impacts at that level, really at the cradle of their supply chain, because they have regulatory obligations, but also because they want to take action on that. And the way we are taking action is by creating a grievance mechanism with local NGOs. So I think a common thread in all of that, it has worked well because we are just a tool. So it's not, as usual, no silver bullet, but we have had partners, and we have structured the system so that the partners could take action. And what makes good data in this case is, one, it has to be honest, and to be honest, it has to be structured from the perspective of the worker. So if you ask the questions in the wrong language, or if you assume that people have data plans, then you may just fall flat on your face. So we do this co-design, and we really try to understand what can we ask, etc. The second is, there is something intrinsically powerful about technology because we can increase the sample size. So we can address the sample bias that you may find in doing interviews, and we can measure outcomes, which is, I think, fairly unique to having that large sample aspects. And the fact that we connect with workers through phones, I mean, can address some of the response bias. So I don't think we quite do the trick, but we can try to overcome some of the fears that workers have. You still have plenty of reasons why trust is not immediate, etc. But that's an important aspect. And I think the final point is trust. Data is good because it's used. So, and what technology enables is, in all the projects there was data sharing, and I think there are lots of things that we can do to increase the amounts of sharing, increase the amount of closing the feedback loop with workers that we're not seeing enough of, but I think that's what makes data good.
Thank you, Antoine. That brings me nicely to Aisha to talk a little bit more about the relational context and human context around which data emerges and which enables kind of data to emerge and challenges to emerge. So from your perspective as a retailer, when it comes to this question of good data and driving meaningful change, could you just describe what Co-op does in terms of your relationships with suppliers that enables that to manifest? And also, what is your kind of general approach to supplier engagement? And you've done a lot of work on top of that, within that, to create kind of locally owned safe spaces for suppliers and others to actually deal with problems that emerge. And so kind of your practical tool seems to be kind of getting people together to kind of talk about these issues. So could you talk more about that?
Sure. Just by way of introduction, I have been in the ethical trade human rights space for coming up to about 20 years now, and been involved in the Sedex journey right from the early days back in 2003, where the very first self-assessment form was being created and the very first SMETA audit was being created in the early days. And one of the observations I've had is that these tools will evolve, and they are some very good tools out there, some where we need to, ask some really challenging questions for them to be more effective. But unless we're also talking about how that data is being used by brands and retailers like the Co-op, and how we encourage transparency in that supply chain, those tools and the data we get will always be limited, because I'm always struck by the kind of where we have a really strong relationship with our suppliers. They feel very comfortable to come to us and tell us about some of those issues. Sometimes we actually would never know about that issue through an SAQ and an audit. And I think that investment in that supplier relationship and creating an enabling environment along that supply chain for people to kind of move on from that kind of mistrust of how that data is going to be used, to actually say, okay, we've got a problem, we've got a challenge, now let's get on with finding that solution, because it's really challenging. As was said this morning, we need to really move on to those systemic changes that are really going to deal with the root causes of issues. So in terms of our supply engagement program, it's kind of evolved over the last 10 years, and it has a number of strands. And I'll share the experience with you, but I'm sure a lot of people in the room are already doing great stuff, but I can share with you that Co-op journey in terms of that experience. On the one strand, we work very closely with a group of our key strategic suppliers that probably represent a high percentage of the production sites in the scope of our monitoring program. We have about in excess of 2,000 sites, both first and second tier, in the food supply chain in 70 countries in the scope of our program. So those key suppliers and the relationship we have with them are a key part of our team. So with those strategic suppliers, we have regular forums where we come together and share best practice, but we also spend a lot of time having those one-to-one conversations, which very often are cross-functional on the Co-op side, but also cross-functional on the supplier side, where strategically we want to talk about what's your long-term vision, what's your plan, because what's really important for us is we don't want to be telling our suppliers how to manage their supply chain. We want to see that leadership from them in terms of how they have a strategic approach and how they invest the resources to manage the issues in the supply chain. We also set regular objectives, which are part of cross-functional business plans, where suppliers will set out what they intend to achieve in terms of their vision on ethical trade over the next year, and we work together on that. So that's what we do at a strategic level. But we have a vast supply chain beyond that. And the UK is our #1 sourcing country. So in the UK, since about probably our very first forum was in 2010, we've established local regional forums where suppliers get together at a really practical level, talk about some of the common issues that sites are facing in that region, share best practice, but also think about how do we kind of face into some of the big challenges we face. And it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone in the room that the big topic of conversation the last 2 years has been around labour shortages and how do we prepare for the uncertainty that we're in at the moment. And that's really practical help for suppliers. At a global level, the co-op doesn't necessarily have a presence in a lot of our key sourcing countries. So we've invested a lot of time and energy in terms of helping to establish local platforms in those key sourcing countries. The very first one we did was in Egypt, and then also in Spain, where we've actually worked very closely with our retailer peers to kind of establish those local spaces, but also, very importantly, find that kind of really key facilitator that has got the trust of the suppliers to be able to create that safe space to drive that change. And that creates an enabling environment all along our supply chain for people to want to work together, learn from each other. I've seen the most impressive changes that suppliers have made, not by us getting, an expert or consultant coming in, though they're all very good, but actually the thing that really always inspires people is when they see another supplier doing something really impressive and really practical and pragmatic, and they take away from that and they kind of drive that change. And that's what we want to create an environment for that to happen. And the kind of two other strands are around how we work with our resources in terms of providing case studies. We have a kind of online platform called Manufacture 2030, the co-op channel, where a lot of kind of debates happen between our suppliers. And then finally, it's about taking that collaborative approach and working in partnership through, of course, really importantly, initiatives like Sedex that we've kind of been a massive supporter of right from the outset, but also initiatives like Stronger Together, ETI, and the Food Network for Ethical Trade. All of these key initiatives kind of form the kind of broader part of our supply engagement programme.
You're provoking a reaction from everyone else there because we've got these wonderful questions coming up, which I will get to a few of them in a moment. But just to ask each of you to talk a little bit about behaviour change. You've all said, what matters is what people do with the data and the information. And so, Aisha, I'm going to stay with you because you have a sort of behaviour change framework that you use with suppliers. And I wonder if you could just describe that a bit more. What is the substance of that, and why behaviour change? Why is that so critical? Then for each of, for Antoine and for Gillian and also Rona, given each of the work you do in different places, whether it's Worker Voice, SAQ, nGaje, polls, what gets in the way of, in your view, of this information driving behaviour change? What are the types of things, maybe not about the quality of data, but about how the data is interpreted or used in the ecosystem that we need to shift so we don't just have more knowledge? How do you move from knowledge to wisdom and action, right? So I'll leave you to ponder those questions, but I'll start with Aisha, and then I'm going to come back to selecting some of these questions to wrap up. Aisha.
Sure, so kind of building on the point I've made kind of so far about that kind of real opportunity to have those open and honest conversations with our suppliers on a one-to-one basis in strategic forums, that gives us a really good understanding of where suppliers are on that journey. And what we want to do is encourage the right behaviours. So we have a framework that we've been working with our suppliers on for a number of years, and that's evolving. And this framework has now kind of formed part of our capability assessment that we do in tenders. So we, understand our suppliers, ability to manage these issues and that forms part of our decision making. But also we have supplier awards where we recognise these behaviours. And they're just kind of very simply, three broad areas. One around proactivity, the second is around ownership, and the third is around partnership. So on proactivity, what we're really looking for is the less we have to chase our suppliers to kind of close off non-compliances, and the more they are kind of managing the issues and kind of being at the front foot of it, the more we want to recognise that good behaviour, which is really going to drive that change and gives us the confidence and issues are being addressed in our suppliers. But also, a really important part of proactivity is that transparency piece. So what we really want to do is encourage suppliers to come and tell us about their problems and reward that that behaviour, because if we know about the problems, we can begin to tackle those issues. Not knowing about the problems is kind of part of the biggest challenges we've got in this space in terms of actually moving to the next stage. The second part is ownership. You know, we've got a vast supply chain, and our key suppliers that we work with are our partners, and we really want them to own this agenda and, you know, very strategically think about how are they kind of managing issues both on their own sites but in their global supply chains. Are they putting in the right resources to be able to manage those issues, and really encourage that to be in place? Because when that's in place, I've been hugely impressed at the growth and the maturity of the program of our suppliers, and that's something that, you know, kind of evolves year on year. And the partnership piece is very much about really kind of recognising those suppliers that are going the extra mile to find those collaborative solutions, deal with systemic issues, understand the root causes of what's causing the issues, but also tackle issues that are really difficult, like modern slavery, in a really, you know, strategic way. And I think finally for us is that encouraging of sharing of best practices, but also sharing of problems with other suppliers that we want to encourage. So the more that suppliers are able to do that. And what we've seen is when we've got those behaviours and those kind of framework very strong, those suppliers actually manage the kind of the issues around audits and non-compliances really well. So that's what we really want to focus our attention on, but that requires time and relationship building.
And just to be clear, do you then internally have an approach where you measure that behaviour? Is that what your analysis does? Okay, that's...
Yeah. And we're looking to evolve that and grow that and make it a lot more transparent for our suppliers. But yes, on a monthly basis, we will report into our commercial colleagues how suppliers are performing, but also it forms part of our kind of capability assessment of suppliers.
Okay, Antoine and then Rona and then Gillian. So what do you think are the big barriers that actually get in the way of people actually using this data meaningfully?
I think
and in 90 seconds.
Yeah, sure. Two barriers, I think. One is, I think we are not going far enough in closing the feedback loop with workers. And why is that an impediment is, I think it's a missed opportunity to tap into workers as agents of change, positive change and you know, creative forces for businesses to get better, being more compliant with code of conduct, but also driving the business. And that's also the foundation for trust, for continuous engagement, etc. So I think I think that's an impediment. And the second, I think, is that the field is still driven by buyers and not enough by suppliers. So I think I don't have the full answer as to how do you get away from that. I can talk about supplier ownership, and I think for me the answer is you need to embed technology in a much bigger vision and a much bigger set of interventions that will give it its right place, but clearly it's an impediment to, I think, much bigger progress.
Rona.
So I think one of the challenges with data is, as we said, is what we do with it once we receive it. And, you know, one of the things that APSCA is doing is, as we're focusing on, you know, being able to help articulate and demonstrate the experience and knowledge that the individual auditors have, we heard Aidan say before that, you know, audits don't fix problems, and it's actually not the audit's role to fix a problem. We have to be working in consultation with each other. But once you do get that audit report, you need to do something about it. But as Aidan said, you know, in the earlier panel from anti-slavery, that sometimes audit can cause bigger issues. And I think part of that comes down to the way that we communicate what the expectations are, the way that we communicate when we found the challenges and what's, you know, called a penalty for having an actual issue. And so I think we need to be looking at ourselves as well about how do we talk to the people that are being audited about what our longer term expectations are, and about that it is a journey, it's a continuous improvement journey, and to try try to be open to talking to them, to be able to get that open and transparent information. You know, you don't want the workers to be hiding and not telling the truth when the interviews are occurring, but if when we get the information, we don't do anything about it, we don't have a quality, robust conversation, then it doesn't really matter what the data is. We have to really be able to sit down and analyze it and do something about it.
Thank you, Rona. Gillian, your reflections on...
Yes, I think for me, one of the things that I find when I go into businesses and they'll say that they know what their workers think, don't need to run a survey, don't need to run a poll, because, you know, every day we go into the factory together and, you know, we talk to each other and they tell me, you know, what my problems, they come to me and they say, and they'll say, we've got our whistleblowing hotline there, you know, and we've never had a call. So I'm sort of saying, oh, that's really good. Have you ever thought that maybe they just don't trust your line and they don't want to be but it's got nothing to do with the fact, I think my thing's gone, nothing to do with the fact that actually you know. And how can you actually guarantee that the little person, I don't mean this stature-wise, that in the corner, the quiet one, who's actually got some really serious issues and doesn't want to come and talk to you and doesn't believe in your hotline, how do you know what they actually think? So for me, I think it's sometimes managers just think they know the issues, they know that, but actually they don't, and they often create the barriers. And where I've found it's worked quite well is where you've done less formalised, and that's where the poll, I suppose, comes into it. So less formalised than the surveys with the very, 65 questions, and much more about feelings, but also included free text boxes. Quite often when we've run things, and you've just allowed it, it's gone out to whoever wants to fill it in, it's all voluntary, they can do it at home, they can do it at work, it's up to them, and then suddenly you'll get back and it's like all of this world, it's like Pandora's box opening up and there's all these words come out and you think, wow, somebody's actually sat down and spent the time to tell me all these things. Sometimes they're good things, they're not always bad, sometimes they're a mix. And obviously there are some bad things in there as well. But actually you suddenly realise that actually, and then you can go back to the managers and say, look, you don't actually know what all of your workers think. You know the ones that are actually happy to come and talk to you, but they're not obviously all the ones. So that for me is one of the barriers that I often come across is just people's perceptions. They think they know when they don't.
Okay. And I'm going to stay with you, Gillian, to answer this very popular question. Is, for engaging, how can we develop the SAQ so that it can be equally useful for significant diverse range of businesses? We really could do a poll on that question.
To be honest.
What's your view from where you sit on this?
I'm not going to duck the question, honestly. I think it's a very valid question and it is difficult. You have got so many people that want to be involved in the design of the SAQ and therefore it will be a challenge. Our aim was to produce something that could be used by all businesses, so there'll be a core SAQ and against the ETI base code, so the SMETA methodology against that, and then look to have modules that would be more specific to different industries, because we cannot, the challenge was to make it smaller. If you then include it for everything that's necessary for every industry, it would be a monster, and it's fairly large as it is. So very much about trying to get it to the core and take out questions that actually don't add any value, don't actually drive some sort of outcome and output, because there's a lot of questions that have just been a bit like your comment about just adding and adding and adding. The SAQ's been added to and added to over the years. Try and get it back to the really important ones that drive some change. And then if we need to have extra ones for different industries, then we'll do it as extra modules.
Thank you. There's a few questions for Rona here, APSCA. So one of them is around, there are many accreditation bodies. So what makes APSCA any better for the auditor or factory being audited? But also this other question at the very top here around whether SMETA audits will require APSCA-approved auditor for the future. What's your understanding of that with your conversations with Sedex?
So as a start, I obviously can't answer it for Sedex, but I can tell you what I hope, and I hope the answer is yes. But in all honesty, if you think about it, if you need a lawyer, if you need an accountant, are you going to go to Joe or Jane at the corner in Australia what we call a milk bar, coffee shop. Are you going to go and find somebody who happens to be sitting there and having a conversation with them about your legal issue or your financial issue, or are you going to go somebody who passed the bar or somebody who actually passed the CPA? And that's really what APSCA are trying to drive, right? So my response to that particular question is, yes, I hope so. If you want a quality audit, you know, why not go to somebody who has passed the exam, or at least on the journey towards passing the exam? They've signed the code of conduct. We are in the process of developing our ethics and integrity issue, or not issue, we've got lots of issues, but panels and ethics boards, etc. So the answer, I really hope, is not just with SMETA, but in any of them, any of you brands as well, the answer hopefully is yes.
Okay. And then I'm going to ask Antoine, I'm going to jump to the end there and ask Antoine, to what extent does there's a question here about whether your tool brings together workers to communicate with each other, and how does it, at the moment, guarantee accountability towards the workers sharing the data and feedback? So that challenge you raised around, you know, workers have inputted into the tool, how do they then perhaps benefit from that input? Do they see results or not? How does it bring them together versus have them be atomized?
Yeah, I think a thorny question is the degree to which technology creates agency, and I think I can see, you know, as a tool, I mean, we see a wide variety. I mean, I see projects where, frankly, I don't even think that's the objective of the user. So the terms of engagement are clear, and I think as long as the expectations that are raised with you know, all parties are that you're not going to do that, then I think it may be a missed opportunity, but that's the way it works. And if you engage with a company that has 10,000 plus first auditors, you're not, I mean, you have a breadth, depth, you know, sort of challenge, and I think it can be the first point of contact, and then after you can go deeper on some aspects, so that's fine. Where it works is, I mean, I think both, you know, giving feedback on an individual level. So with the tool, you can send back some content. I mean, it cannot be very rich, so there are some you know, challenges there. What is good is when you have, you know, worker representatives, third parties. I mean, that varies quite a bit, that are there to receive the data and also interpret it. And I think the moment we see that sort of discussion around co-generated data, that's good. I mean, after I am just a tool, I'm a servant. And what happens next is I think is really helpful. So that's the way we see it.
Okay. We have run out of time in this panel, unfortunately, but I know that all of you missed all the questions. I've got a number of very specific questions to each of you, and I know the four of you will be here as well for the rest of the afternoon, and so please do come and ask some of those questions, continue the conversation. So I'd just like to say thank you to Sedex, but also thank you to the four of you for the session and the panel. You know, I think we've begun to, it was a very short panel, but trying to unpack this idea, and I think going into the afternoon, as we talk about practical tools, as we talk about data, right, how does it really link into this behavior change? Because certainly within our work at Shift, we see a lot of faith in outputs leading to outcomes, right? New knowledge, new information, new data, and then outcomes in terms of meaningful change for workers and communities. And often there's a missing golden thread in the middle, right? Which is actually changing our behavior, changing the culture of how business is done, changing our attitudes to problems, changing the incentive systems. And so I hope this afternoon we don't lose track of what you've all tried to bring to this, is that you've got to use the data, right, in meaningful ways to drive change. And that's fundamentally critical, because otherwise it's just more and more and more. So thank you very much, and thank you to Sedex, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you.